Peter, welcome to Validated.
Thanks, Austin. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. You and Eric Voorhees are two people I've wanted to talk to for a while.
Oh, that's good company to be in. I like that.
Yeah, and I really do think that you and Coin Center deserve to be in that same sentence there. So I want to get into a lot of what's gone on in U.S. policy and crypto policy in the last, let's call it 9 months. A little bit on crypto's impact or lack of impact on election. But I want to kind of start off with a grounding of what is Coin Center? How did you first get into this space? And show us on why we should all donate to Coin Center.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the executive director of Coin Center. Coin Center has been around for over 10 years now, which makes me like ancient in crypto years.
You're a whole Zcash.
I know. So in 2014, and this is like an ancient history lesson for some folks, but the Bitcoin Foundation was one of the few organizations that was doing public policy work. They also employed early Bitcoin core devs like Gavin Andreessen. And they had some issues with some of their board members' reputations, I guess I'll put it that way. And they just generally were not at that time effective as a voice for Bitcoin in DC. And this was back when it was just the beginning, like people in Congress or people at the agencies might have had an inkling as to what Bitcoin was. Ethereum hadn't even launched yet. People had questions. There were ransomware attacks. There was the Silk Road. And I think smart people in our space, some angels who supported our runway for the first few years, thought it would be really good to have an organization in DC that's dedicated to educating people in Congress and the agencies about Bitcoin. And the mission wasn't just narrow to Bitcoin. It was, any kind of open blockchain network, open source software. Jerry Brito was our original executive director. He just retired at the end of last year. We couldn't convince him to stay any longer. Myself, Robin Weissman, a few others started Coin Center back then. And the goal was just to have neutral, unvarnished information about the tech so that policymakers could make good policy from a position of knowledge rather than policy that would have unintended consequences, like the overbroad application of securities laws or any number of other topics that we can get into on this podcast. And so in the early days, it was mostly going to congressional offices and meeting with the lead staffer, who was the one curious enough about crypto to get their boss interested. And I still remember my first time I met with Landon Zinda, who's actually now at the SEC, but was at Tom Emmer's office at the time. And Tom Emmer's majority whip in the House, probably the best champion for crypto that we have, certainly in the House at the moment. And I remember the first meeting with Landon, and Landon was asking all these questions like, oh, so you're worried about money transmission licensing? Can we create a safe harbor? And so these were the beginnings of bills that are still winding their way through Congress, because Congress doesn't do things quickly. But I think it made a big difference for there to be a team that was just there to explain how the tech works, help them craft definitions around things like non-custodial service providers and things like that you might want excluded from state licensing law or federal registration, and just advocate for ultimately the passage of those laws, which we're still doing to this day. It's a long, slow slog working with government, but we love what we do. And things have changed radically over the 10 years. We, as I said, started more with things like education and outreach to agencies in Congress. As things got worse in some ways because of some changes in law, like the Infrastructure Act several years ago, which implemented stricter tax reporting requirements, and then the OFAC sanctions against Tornado Cash, we sort of pivoted from just doing education to also doing litigation. So we actually have 4 lawsuits against the U.S. government right now that are still active. Some of them might be winding down in light of the change, the Tornado Cash sanctions designations and some other things. But we at this point combine sort of a mission that's focused on education and outreach with a civil liberties impact litigation mission as well, where if we see that there's a reporting obligation or registration requirement that's stifling speech or harming people's legitimate privacy interests, we'll potentially bring a lawsuit, either as the plaintiffs ourselves, if we have standing, or help find somebody who has standing and support their challenge. And that's more the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, so one of the pieces I wanna kind of get into here is that the origins of Coin Center were not, I would say, consensus at the time, and the work you guys were doing was not really. I mean, I think it was very important. I've always been an advocate for engagement, but engagement was not a good word until maybe 2023, I would say. Like in the early days, there was sort of this, like this was back in like the malaise of tech where we were just starting as a country to realize that like, oh, big tech actually has a lot of power over our elections. But crypto was still sort of on the outside of a lot of this. There was this idea of like, we don't need governments. We are above or under or orthogonal or in some ways outside of the sphere of politics. So what do you think changed that got people to go from this perspective of engagement is not worth our time? Also, Sam Bankman-Fried went heavy on engagement, and look what that got him and the rest of the industry, to now in 2025, where if you don't have a policy arm and a major L1 or L2 foundation, you're behind the curve. Like, what actually happened over the last 6 years that moved the Overton window so far?
I might even be a little spicy, and I don't know if all L1s should have policy arms, but
they do.
Yeah, they do. It's true. It's happening, and maybe it's inevitable. I'd like to go back to just the original premise, which is that like pre-2022, 23, the general like trend within the ecosystem was engagement is a mistake, or we don't need to be engaged, or we don't need to be there. I think you're right in like a general characterization, but I don't know how deliberate that was. I think, a lot of projects were young. I think there were a lot of lawyers, and Coin Center doesn't give advice to private projects. So anyone listening, don't listen to my advice on this podcast. It's not legal advice, but there were a lot of lawyers giving advice that said that, like, look, if you do like a SAFT offering for your token, you're not going to be within the SEC's jurisdiction, which
we see how well that went.
I mean, there was an argument there, right? But we see how well that went. But I would also say that, when people asked us when we were only 4 or 5 years old, so back in 2018, 2019, what do you think of U.S. policy towards crypto? We weren't apocalyptic at all. We would say, actually, U.S. policy towards crypto is really quite good. It's paradigmatically U.S. regulation, which means, yes, there are like 8 or 9, let alone 50 states and territories, but 8 or 9 federal regulators who all kind of might have a piece of this. And sometimes they say things that sound internally contradictory, like the IRS will say that crypto's property for taxes, while the SEC will say some of them might be securities, while the CFTC might say some of them are commodities, but for the purposes of commodities derivatives. And so that can seem very chaotic. But in general, what was the actual policy back then? You had the SEC taking an active role policing some obvious frauds in the space, like really bad Ponzi scheme type coins that didn't even have a credible argument towards decentralization or anything like that. Like Jay Clayton's SEC was, I think, actually pretty reasonable as far as their targets. We could debate some of the edge cases. At FinCEN, in 2019, you had guidance saying that if you don't have total independent control over user funds, you're not a money transmitter and don't need to register and don't need to have an AML KYC program. And that guidance was actually like incredibly clear for the time. They even went through and had multiple different like activities you might engage in. Among them, things like anonymizing software provider versus anonymizing service provider, which is I mean, I
pretty
couldn't ask
sophisticated definitions.
Sophisticated definitions and the right policy. The statement from the regulator for anti-money laundering purposes, which is serious shit because we're talking about illicit finance and even terrorism. But the regulator saying, look, if what you're doing is providing tools for other people to move money and you don't move their money for them, you don't need to do this kind of surveillance and registration. But if you do control other people's money, you do. And so when people would ask us in 2019, should we engage in policymaking? We'd say, well, be cautious, because actually the landscape right now is surprisingly good. You might have some edge cases, some issues you want to raise, like something we've advocated for a long time is a de minimis carve out from capital gains taxation for people who are like buying things with crypto, because it's silly that you have to calculate capital gains every time you pay a mining fee.
Yes.
In theory you do. But that's sort of marginal, right? And then things changed pretty dramatically. in a number of ways. I think the SEC became very aggressive towards projects and people in the space, including even towards the, more regulatory compliant, more adult secondary markets. Like they sued Coinbase. Simultaneously, you saw OFAC add the Tornado Cash smart contracts to the sanctions list, which we can get into later in this podcast. But, that's a very aggressive move that says Americans are now banned from using these smart contracts. And you had the Infrastructure Act passed in Congress, which set up the 6050I reporting requirements and redefined broker in the context of crypto to potentially include all kinds of non-custodial entities like DeFi providers, which would mean if that had gone forward, and we can talk about how that changed as well, if that had gone forward, like a Uniswap or whatever would have to know all their users and identify the capital gains of their users and report as a broker to the IRS what their users were earning in capital gains, which I think is unconstitutional, frankly, but it's also bad policy, wouldn't have worked. And we're lucky that that's one of our recent victories is the Congress passed, using the Congressional Review Act, passed a joint resolution that withdrew that broker definition and killed it. So, go back far enough, public policy was actually pretty good for crypto in the US. Yeah. And so maybe it was the right thing to say, I don't need to be engaged in DC, because maybe you didn't need to be engaged in DC. Now, maybe we were failing to lay the appropriate groundwork to stop the onslaught that then came. But I'm not even sure that we would have done better. The winds changed. And the things you mentioned are the big things that changed it. You had Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX basically just committing mass financial fraud. And there's almost nothing crypto related to that other than the fact that it was a crypto exchange. This is just run-of-the-mill accounting fraud and bad business practices.
Right. There was no crypto fraud at FTX. It was fraud that happened to include crypto.
Exactly. And then, I did a presentation a couple, maybe like a year ago, the 4 harbingers of the crypto apocalypse or the public policy apocalypse. The FTX was one of them. Another obvious one is Terra Luna. Yep. Another obvious one.
Which, to be fair, the government kind of got that one right.
Totally.
Doe was served.
Yes, exactly. I think a big one that we don't maybe discuss often enough anymore is Facebook, now Meta's decision to launch a stablecoin, Libra, which, as you said, big tech was already, had the shine had worn off, and especially in Congress, they were like the enemy of the day to score political points, and maybe for good reason, right? Big tech has a lot of control that maybe they shouldn't have, and so Facebook deciding that they're going to launch Libra suddenly made what was more of a niche technological regulatory issue of crypto suddenly, oh no, this is another way to criticize big tech, perhaps justifiably, and the rollout of Libra from a political standpoint was very messy. Like members of Congress were surprised by the press release. And then even if they might have been inclined to defend Facebook with Libra, they were just taken aback. And then there were others in Congress who were very happy to use this as another point of attack on Facebook, with some legitimate public policy questions as to what would it look like if one of the largest social media companies was to now be one of the largest movers of money around the world. So that, and then the fourth one would be the Tornado Cash sanctions. I think you just had suddenly a very different landscape, both because, in some ways, because of bad actors in our ecosystem. Not to say that Facebook is one of the bad actors, but their rollout was extraordinarily attention-grabbing and controversial. And then bad policy responses to those bad actors in the form of the Infrastructure Act, in the form of the Tornado Cash sanctions. I would also add that I don't think Tornado Cash were bad actors. Lazarus Group definitely are bad actors, and they use the Tornado Cash tools, which is what triggered those sanctions. And then we had to have a whole discussion over whether, if you give bad people good tools, are you yourself, at fault for that, right?
So I actually want to double click on Tornado Cash for a bit, because this is the one when I talk to my family, my friends around, they're like, okay, I get government trying to kill crypto is bad. I get that what you are doing, but at the time at Solana, is good. I get that Bitcoin has a use in the world. This is, again, quoting these people I talk to, I have a very difficult time squaring the moral framework of Tornado Cash with the fact that I live in a society. Right. And it's like, it's one thing to be like, I'm a frontiersman out in the wilderness where there's no one
Interesting.
around, and like self-sovereignty, and like we go all Atlas shrugged really quickly. It's another thing to be like, yeah, but these are like modern digital tools that North Korea is laundering money to build nukes to there's even like the most practical implications of like, for every dollar Lazarus launders for North Korea, my tax bill goes up by probably 10 or 20 bucks just from a national security budget perspective, right? And then there's sort of just the view of like, we have to have a way to block them out of these systems, right? Like, and this is, I think, one of the ones that a lot of people who are like yourself and me and like Peter Voorhees are more libertarian minded often sort of gloss over this idea of like, yeah, but we have freedom and freedom's important. And so like, you just have to accept some trade-offs. And for a lot of people, that is the stumbling block that they can't get over, to say like, okay, like I get this, like privacy is a something people should have access to. People should have access to good tools. Why can't we just like kick North Korea off Tornado Cash? Why is that such a, like, it's like your classic bad cases make bad law.
Mhm.
And like, why didn't Tornado Cash just head this off in the front and say, yeah, all right, look, like we're largely open, but there's a few blacklists for like overt terrorists. How do you sort of, because you guys have to lobby this. You had to,
I love the question.
yes.
The question, why couldn't we just kick Lazarus Group off Tornado Cash? Or why wouldn't that be the right policy?
Yeah, in a way that doesn't sound like very sort of like Chicken Little or like Catholic Church.
So that would have been the right policy. But that wasn't the policy of the U.S. government. I mean, so a few things. I like to think of like alternative worlds, right? So you go back to 2021, 2022. When was the Ronin Bridge hack? I don't have my chat GPT up, so that part of my brain's broken. Yeah, I think it was 2022. So you've got, large amounts of money being laundered because of the Ronin Bridge hack by Lazarus Group. And one of the tools that they use to try to obfuscate the trail of their transactions is Tornado Cash, right? Now, Tornado Cash is software developed by people in the Ethereum community who have the right idea. Now, you got to like get people to that first step. Why is it right to have software like Tornado Cash out there? And the reason, as you said, is actually because we do want to live in a society. Because in a society, you don't we don't all live in glass houses. I don't like look across the street right now at my neighbor Rob and I'm like, oh, look, Rob's in his underwear on his third floor. Like I can see his third floor right now, but there's a wall. And the thing about, pre-Zcash blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and plenty of more modern blockchains is that they're fully transparent. And yeah, there's no identifying information. You don't see like Peter Van Valkenburgh sent to Austin this amount of Bitcoin, but you can very easily figure out that my address is my address, Austin's address is Austin's address, and then you can see all the transactions, right?
Yes.
And so if we want to live in a society, we need to make these tools better. And the way they need to be better is to have inherent levels of privacy, even I think on the L1s ultimately, but at the very least, some sort of non-trusted, non-third-party tool that will just allow me to anonymize my transactions on chain, just so that I can live in a society without constantly hemorrhaging all of my personal information to be exploited by corporations or by governments. And that's kind of a libertarian idea, but it's also a very liberal.
It is, yeah. So
99%
of people are 100% with you up to this point.
Right.
Like at this point, you've got everyone.
Okay. So then the question is, why can't we just kick Lazarus off of Tornado Cash?
Yes.
And as I said, my answer is that would have been the right policy. So people don't realize that the developers of the Tornado Cash tool actually developed a quote unquote compliance tool. It's probably not the best name for what that was because it makes it sound like Tornado Cash is doing compliance, when in reality, the compliance tool for Tornado Cash was another piece of software that would allow a user of Tornado Cash to do their own compliance. And the way this worked was if you put money into the Tornado Cash smart contract, which meant nobody else in the world controlled it. It was just you in control of your money, but now in a way that protected your privacy. And you took your money out of that smart contract because now that you've achieved privacy on chain, you want to go to Coinbase and, cash out or send it to somewhere else. You could use the compliance tool to selectively reveal your past transaction history to the person you're sending money to so that they could verify that you are not the Lazarus group.
Yes.
And what could have happened back in 2022, 2023 is, the U.S. Treasury and the regulators tasked with anti-money laundering could have gone around to the regulated crypto exchanges and been like, hey, there's this new tool for privacy. It's called Tornado Cash. And the exchange probably would have said, oh, yeah, we won't process any withdrawals from that. We won't touch it. We won't even look at it. But the sensible thing would have been to say, no, actually, it's okay. The developers built a compliance tool. So if you have a customer who's bringing funds from the Tornado Cash smart contract to your custodial exchange, just ask for them to sign a cryptographically verifiable message that shows that they are not the North Korean, Lazarus group laundering funds through Tornado Cash, and that it's actually just me, Peter Van Valkenburgh, who had some crypto. Maybe I got paid my salary in crypto,
Sure.
and now I want to cash it out, but I want privacy about my salary. And I can prove that the original transaction was from my employer to me. Then there was the privacy step through Tornado Cash, and now there's Coinbase. If that had been the advice from regulators at the time, and if we had also done a good job ring fencing and closing non-compliant foreign exchanges who wouldn't ask for these extra compliance steps, then, okay, Lazarus Group puts its money into the Tornado Cash smart contract, which is permissionless. It's something that we can't stop. But we could stop them from ever getting the benefit of those funds leaving the Tornado Cash smart contract because we make it effectively impossible for them to ever withdraw to a place where they can get the benefit of real money, like dollars or whatever, in an exchange.
But don't we run into like the Macau problem really quickly? Like when
Casinos?
you have, yeah, right. Like, so like in a world of physical bullion goods, right? A bar of gold has a certain amount of transport limitations on it. It's very hard to bring it through an airport. It's very hard to, if you were I keep thinking about how like the most effective way the U.S. pivoted to fighting ISIS was to stop bombing the militants and start bombing the warehouses where they stored their hard U.S. currency. And the minute that they couldn't pay their militants anymore, ISIS kind of was over, right? It was far more effective to kill the money than to actually kill the people. But in a world where like crypto can be moved globally, all you need is one non-compliant exit funnel, and it might take you 3 years to get $600 million out through casino chip money laundering, like does happen in Macau. But you like the leakiness problem is different when you have all of the properties we know and love about crypto, full self-sovereignty and full global portability.
So I'm not sure they're that different.
Okay.
Even in the traditional financial world, we do not anywhere close to approximate 100%, compliance and control.
Yes.
Not even close. In fact, there's a good argument to be made, although, like partisans on one side will bring their studies about like amounts of illicit funds traveling through the traditional financial system, and partisans on the other will bring their studies. But, the underground economy is massive. The amount of money laundering that happens through traditional financial institutions is massive.
Yes.
And I think certainly in absolute terms, much larger than in crypto. And I think even in percentage terms, there's an argument that it's larger than what happens through crypto. And so we don't actually live in a world where we could say that, well, all we can do in crypto is like some like sloppy deterrence, but in the real financial world or in the traditional financial world, we have actual like visibility and control. We actually live in the opposite world. I think we can do more deterrence in crypto, and deterrence is only the ever goal. It is always the only goal.
Yes.
Like all you can do is increase the frictions to bad people moving their money around, whether it's in the crypto system or whether it's in the traditional financial system. You're never going to actually be able to fully interdict and stop. So the anti-money laundering regime that we have, the Bank Secrecy Act, and it's been globally exported through FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, means that we all have to like hand over tons of private data to our financial institutions in order to just even open an account. Our accounts get closed all the time. And the question is, for all this financial surveillance and control, what do we get out of it? The UN itself estimates that only about 0.02% of illicit finance actually ever gets interdicted and seized.
Yeah.
It's vanishingly small.
Leaky, yes.
Now,
there's also like a very serious point about like, I'm not sure how BSA passes the Fourth Amendment, but I'm not a lawyer.
Yes, we've written a couple reports on the Bank Secrecy Act's constitutionality, which we can get into. But, constitutional law aside, does the current regime actually effectively deter illicit finance? No, it doesn't in the traditional context. And I think we can do better in our space, but we need to cooperate with the people who are building these tools rather than surprise them with prosecutions for things like unlicensed money transmission, which is what's happened to the Tornado Cash developers.
Yeah.
Like, these are people who built an interesting compliance tool to add costs to bad actors getting the benefit of the privacy tools they were developing. Now, instead of working with them and working with regulated exchanges to make that compliance tool maximally deterrent of illicit finance, you saw no interaction, maybe because people in our space don't want to engage with government because they're afraid to, but also maybe because people in government don't engage in the right way proactively to leverage these tools to deter illicit finance. There's probably failures on both sides. And then when you see a particularly bad thing happen, like the Ronin Bridge hack and Lazarus Group getting the benefit of stolen crypto funds, instead of finding a way forward, you see a prosecution of the people that developed the tools that enabled the Lazarus Group, even though the developers didn't have any coordination with the Lazarus Group, any intent to facilitate that money laundering. Right. So, your best allies here are the people who are building privacy and identity tools. And one thing that we're getting into in Coin Center right now is thinking about public policy towards user sovereign digital ID, which is a whole nother topic, to maybe actually improve the know your customer regime and the anti-money laundering regime. But suffice it to say, we need better technologies to combat what is a technological problem of money laundering. And if you frighten people away from the US so they don't want to build these tools here, you're just going to end up lessening the amount of deterrence you can do towards illicit finance rather than bolstering it.
Yeah, the state of KYC is basically non-functional anymore in the world of AI. It is it is really interesting how the Solana Foundation runs a delegation program, and the amount of work they've had to do into getting rid of Sybils and AI fakes, and there's a whole bunch of other changes happening with the program, but the number of fake submissions is just up dramatically. In large part thanks to AI and to stolen identities. I do want to talk a little bit about moving into modern times. Yeah. Some of the new DOJ guidance around 1960s Act and this sort of idea of maybe ending regulation by enforcement. There is a lot that we've seen there that seems to be moving in the right direction, but at the same time, we haven't gotten much yet, it feels like, in terms of actual legislative changes. So how big of a change is the DOJ's position under this administration? How substantive do you think it is? And then I want to talk a little bit about some of both the pending bills that are making their way through.
Yeah. So when you consider how bad things were on the liability front for software developers at the end of the last administration, we have seen progress. It's impossible to deny that we've seen real progress. So sorry to keep going back and not deal with current times, but if you go back, there are sanctions against the Tornado Cash smart contracts, which means Americans can't even use them for legitimate purposes, which Coin Center sued over because we'd accepted donations using Tornado Cash to protect the privacy of our donors. That's illegal. We can't do that. And the developers of those tools, like Roman Storm and the Southern District of New York, are being prosecuted for unlicensed money transmission, which is the 18 U.S.C. 1960 statute you mentioned. And people who want to build new versions of these tools that could actually be better for personal privacy while increasing deterrence of illicit finance, like maybe the privacy pools guys, like Amin, he's a wild man, so he wouldn't mind that I mentioned him just now, are thinking why would I build these tools if I'm just going to end up in jail for them? So things did get better. We saw, thanks to the plaintiffs in the Fifth Circuit, the Van Loon plaintiffs, who also sued at the same time Coin Center sued, we saw the Fifth Circuit say, okay, OFAC doesn't actually have the authority to sanction immutable smart contracts. And eventually, OFAC in the new administration delisted all of those smart contracts.
Yeah.
And so now Americans are free to use that tool again. And we have actually binding legal precedent from the Fifth Circuit that OFAC in the future can't go and just tell Americans not to use an immutable software tool, which is huge progress and really good. Now, as far as the prosecutions of developers who built those tools for privacy, you didn't see an immediate shift.
Yeah.
After a few months, the Deputy Attorney General Blanche, he released a memo saying, and the title of the memo was a great title, Ending Regulation by Prosecution. And, I don't know if we can claim credit for this. We did write a blog post about how the Tornado Cash prosecutions are regulation by prosecution. Other people said that as well. So it was a very encouraging memo. But the memo said, look, we're gonna focus on actual bad actors, like the narco traffickers, like the terrorists, like Lazarus Group, and we're not going to focus on prosecuting people who build tools that those bad actors use. So sounds perfect, right? Exactly what we're asking for and exactly what the right policy is. In the wake of that memo, and this is only now 2 weeks ago, Jay Clayton, former SEC chair and incoming head of the Southern District of New York, where these prosecutions are taking place. And I'm saying prosecutions plural because there's the Tornado Cash developers. There's also the developers of the Samurai wallet, which is a Bitcoin privacy wallet, that both being prosecuted in SDNY. The Jay Clayton letter says, we're going to drop one of the two unlicensed money transmission charges. We're not going to proceed to trial on that. That's good because that one of two, that one was the most obviously internally contradictory as far as U.S. regulatory policy, because that charge said you are a financial institution under the Bank Secrecy Act, even though FinCEN in 2019 said you're not a financial institution under the Bank Secrecy Act if you're not holding customer funds. And so that charge never should have been brought to begin with, and it's good that they dropped that charge. They kept the second unlicensed money transmission charge, though, which is knowingly transmitting criminal funds or transporting. So there's another verb in that part of the criminal code that's not in the Bank Secrecy Act. And the prosecution's argument back before they dropped the first charge, and probably still with the second charge going forward, is that there's two different definitions of money transmission. One that FinCEN opines on, and we won't charge that because FinCEN said that doesn't cover this kind of thing. But another in the criminal code that we can interpret differently than the regulator. But the insanity there is it's still an unlicensed money transmission charge. And so who do you license with if you're violating that part of the U.S. code? FinCEN said you're not a money transmitter. This isn't a state licensing issue because they never charged the part of 18 U.S.C. 1960 that has to do with state licensing. And so you're unlicensed even though nobody asked you to license. So to me, there's the sort of nonsensical quality of that charge. There's also the rule of lenity, which is a constitutional jurisprudential sort of ideal within the U.S. system, which is if somebody's on the wrong end of a criminal prosecution and the criminal code is ambiguous, you give them the benefit of the doubt. That's the rule of lenity. We want to be lenient to people who are about to lose their liberty. That's another good reason to drop that charge. But this is all to say, like a long-winded legal way of saying they didn't drop both charges of unlicensed money transmission. They also didn't drop the conspiracy to violate sanctions charge or the conspiracy to do money laundering charges, which you could argue, especially the money laundering charge, is more fact-dependent, so maybe leave that to a jury. I still think that their argument's very weak on that charge. And the conspiracy to violate sanctions charge, I think, is also off base. So a long way of saying the memo was meaningful, was the right topic, was the right analysis. The resultant change in prosecutions was only maybe 30% there. And that's frustrating to me because they took away the charge that was maybe the easiest to defend against. But now we still have to, Brian Klein, the lawyer for Roman Storm, will still have to go forward and challenge these other charges, and hopefully he wins and the Roman Storm goes free, but it's a mess still.
So, I mean, the easy thing, and I don't really mean the easy thing, but like if you're talking to someone not in crypto, they would say the easy thing to do is to just include somewhere in the smart contract, the contract's immutable, an updatable blacklist. So that if FinCEN flags, like this is a wallet address from North Korea, like, okay, great, now it's kicked off. This is from Hamas. Okay, great, you can't use it anymore. I think there's a lot of reasons that makes people in our industry uncomfortable. At the same time, we kind of just saw Sui do this with a hack on one of their DeFi protocols that stole about $250 million worth of SUI tokens at the time. And now basically every epoch, validators are downloading a file that updates a blacklist to prevent those funds that the attacker stole from moving. The validator network is basically colluding to disallow transfers of a specific token at the express endorsement of the founders of SUI. I'm not sure if exactly it's from the foundation or the lab side, but this is like very much a top-down organized activity. Do you think that's correct? Is that good? Is that bad? Does that sort of, peek under, like, is this the part we're not supposed to talk about, which is that, the validators at the end of the day can always collude to prevent a transaction from going through?
No, I mean, power is power on these networks. Like even going back to the early days of Bitcoin, one of the original core devs, Luke Jr., from my understanding, I don't know him personally, he's very Catholic, and he lobbied fellow miners to like block Satoshi Dice transactions, not because he was trying to enforce state gambling laws or anything like that, but simply because he thought that like gambling had no business on the Bitcoin blockchain. And that the validators always have this choice. That's one of the more truly decentralized stories in our space, is that at the end of the day, the people who actually form the blockchain can have some level of discretion and can enforce policies that they want to enforce. And so if that discretion exists, it should be used. We shouldn't pretend that that discretion doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Now, the harder question is, should people, when they publish a smart contract onto one of these L1s, or when they publish a new L1 protocol, just on GitHub to be executed by others who actually operate the relevant nodes, like, could you be liable for publishing that software either to a chain or to a GitHub repository if you did it in a way that failed to accommodate blacklisting?
Yeah.
And that's where I get off the, yes, let's do everything to stop illicit financing train, because I don't think that would stop illicit financing, because there's always going to be other people who publish this software that don't have those blacklists in them. And if we try to round up everybody who's publishing software and make sure they publish only the software we want them to publish, then we've sacrificed our First Amendment principles, which is that the government doesn't get a prior restraint on the publication of new ideas and new tools for the betterment of humanity. Because even if you think the government's going to do that well, like, oh, they're only going to tell you to not publish the software that's bad software. Like, this is a road we don't go down in the US. We don't create that bureau of censorship. So that sets us up for sort of maybe you could think of it as a difficult trade-offs, but I don't think they're that difficult. I think where these systems maintain some level of discretion, developers and people running that infrastructure should voluntarily, if they're so interested, take steps to deter illicit finance. Policymakers should be interacting with those people to encourage them to cooperate with investigations and take voluntary steps. We've seen the emergence of like crypto ISAC and SEAL and projects in this space that actually want to share threat intelligence, because they're just good at looking at blockchains and tracking illicit funds and identifying hacks. We should be sharing that with law enforcement. There should be probably even more regularization and formalization of these voluntary steps that people can do to deter illicit finance. The hard question is, when do steps become mandatory, right?
Yeah.
And there might be room for more regulated licensed entities that have mandatory compliance obligations in our space. There's already the exchanges. There's already the custodial exchanges like Coinbase. And that's where we can exert the maximal amount of power. But at some far end of who should actually be obligated up front, you do have to stop. You can't just say anybody who's going to publish a software tool needs to get licensed and registered before they publish.
Yeah, and we do have these ideas of separation in the traditional technology stack. Like, the liability for AWS is higher than for Verizon as the person who carries that packet over the network, right? Like, Verizon is under no legal obligation to, for example, block money transmission data bits flowing over its network that are going to, say, North Korea, right?
Right.
If AWS were running a service where someone was operating a money transmitter system for North Korea, there might be a different story there, right? And so we see like the lower you get down in the infrastructure stack, generally the more leeway you have on not having to enforce types of content moderation. And it seems like that's become very flattened in crypto, where we went very quickly from sort of like, oh, wallets and dApps to like, as you were talking about the Infrastructure Act back in 2022, where like there was a Warren proposal to basically make validators responsible for the content of every transaction that they process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you got to draw that line somewhere. And there's two ways to draw it, I think. There's differentiating between speech and conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And if what you're doing is really just publishing new ideas, new software, new technologies, you're definitely firmly within speech. And I think also, if you're playing some sort of neutral communications type infrastructure role, what you're doing is credibly speech. So the US Constitution gives us this nice dividing line between speech and conduct. Conduct doesn't get all of the protections from prior restraint. So once you're actually taking the affairs of your users in hand, and this could get relevant in the context of like user interface design.
Sure.
Could get relevant.
Or intent-based protocols.
Then maybe you start to be on the hook for certain things, right? Once you're actually like a discretionary actor and not just someone relaying packets effectively, including signed transaction messages and say an L1. So that's an interesting way to parse where the distinction should be and where the dividing line should be. And the other is just less of a constitutional analysis as to what's protected as the free exchange of ideas versus regulatable as conduct. There's just the efficacy question and the sort of question of just economics of network systems. We don't regulate packet switching networks, not just because it would be maybe unconstitutional to do so, but also because it would just shutter and destroy the global information economy. Like if an ISP was liable for any particular aspect of the content of the packets that they're relaying, whether it was because of terrible things like CSAM or because of money transmission packets or because of any other, nobody would be in the business of being an ISP anymore. So this is where we kind of get back to that discussion we were having earlier about deterrence versus control. You want people to deter bad activity on these networks, but if you think you can lock these networks down completely, you're just going to actually destroy the viability of the network system, right?
Yeah, I do see there's sort of two, I would call them like harbingers hanging over us right now that I sort of see when I look out into the potential legal land space. I think one of them is a centralized sequencer. It's very hard to argue that's not making content decisions about what goes into a block with absolute control over what's included and what's not. And like, man, that feels like an MTL lawsuit waiting to happen on some level. The second are AI agents, and which are acting with intention, and they are making quote unquote decisions. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how AI agents more broadly are treated from a regulatory perspective. Not just in crypto, but across all sorts of domains, to see, like, do we actually have some sort of like Section 230 for automated code programs? Or are we in a situation where everything that an agent does is considered a like intentioned action taken on behalf of the software author or not? I'm kind of curious if you guys have thought about that at Coin Center.
I haven't thought about the AI agent question that much. Like, can you construct a hypothetical?
Sure. So I designed a trading bot system, and it executes a profitable trading strategy, which is considered market manipulation.
Like spoofing.
Yes. Right. Or, it intentionally engages in, sandwich attacks in a way that like clearly is illegal. Or it, is created and happens to interact with a bunch of sanctioned wallets.
Yeah. I mean, well, if you're intentionally designing software to spoof.
But what if you're not, right? Like, it's sort of the argument about like, no one intentionally teaches their kid to like punch someone else in the playground, but like sometimes things happen. And as a parent, you have to like deal with the repercussions of that.
Okay, well, but now we've made it complicated. Like, hold on. Is the spoofing behavior emergent behavior of an AI that's like capable of rewriting its own code, or is it actually like?
But these are problems you face like in even like in AI from a few years ago. Like you program an AI to get as many points as it can in a video game, and it'll do crazy things like do donuts at the starting ring to just collect coins inevitably. Like, and then it'll figure out that there's a time penalty based on how quickly you complete a thing, and so it'll get as many points as possible and then kill itself. Like you can these systems are designed to test the limits of the rules that they're set into. And so we're not even talking about something where something's intentionally doing something, right? It's sort of like no one intentionally introduces bugs into their smart contract code, but they do exist. And if you take the position of code is law, well, those bugs are no more illegitimate. Like AI is morally neutral. It doesn't understand the legal framework of why manipulating a bug in a smart contract is wrong. But like it's pretty you can concoct a lot of very easy plausible theories that don't require particularly advanced AI, where a system on chain where it is not operating in as much of a sandboxed walled garden as you see in traditional finance does things that run afoul of what any lawyer would say, oh, you can't do that.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard question. So just some legal background. The case that's most on point here is probably CFTC versus Thacker, I think is how you pronounce it. It was a 2018 case where a software developer wrote spoofing software, just straight up software for spoofing for a client. And their client was another guy who wanted to, in commodities derivatives markets, put a bunch of orders in the order book and then take them away to make it look like the market was moving a certain way and then trade against what everybody was assuming the market was about to do, which is the textbook definition of spoofing. And so the developer, Thacker, was found liable, even though what he did was developing software, right? And the question was like, okay, well, how do you square this with the First Amendment?
Yes.
And there's an answer there that makes sense, which is they knowingly did something that was by definition illegal. They knowingly wrote software at the request of somebody who said, I want to do something illegal. I want you to write me the software to do something illegal. Now, at this point, you're not actually charging this person with writing an illegal idea. That would be like, no idea is illegal. We don't regulate speech. You're saying you talked with a guy who told you that they were going to commit a crime. And after they told you they were going to commit a crime, spoofing, you aided them. You did some things for them, including writing software.
Right. This is the argument of like, if you tell me you're going to rob a bank, can you borrow my gun? And I give you the gun.
Right. Or if I tell you I'm going to rob a bank, can you draw me a map of the bank's layout so I know where the vault is and where to like point the guns? Yeah. Like, yes, that map is a speech act. You've written a map. Maps are important. In the marketplace of ideas, we want more maps, even more maps of banks. But if you do it in response to somebody who says, I'm going to use this to put people's lives in jeopardy and steal money, then you are an accomplice to a crime, right? Now, that's why that case is relatively straightforward as far as the First Amendment analysis. Although, let me interject something, though. Like, this is also not a prior restraint analysis. And this is not a prior restraint hypothetical. In this hypothetical, you're not being arrested for publishing an AI agent without first getting a license to publish AI agents. You're doing something fully legal, but then maybe being held liable after the fact for the bad things your agent did. That's not prior restraint.
Right.
Like
correct.
You can be held liable for defamation because if I said, Austin is a criminal, he's launched multiple criminal projects, don't take his money, he should be in jail. Now, Austin, you can sue me for defamation, even though everything I just did was speech, right?
Yes.
And there's an important distinction between that kind of liability for me and an ex ante liability where I'm not even allowed to start saying your name before first getting it okayed by a government censor. That would be a prior restraint case. So defamation liability doesn't violate the First Amendment because it happens after the fact, whereas censorship before somebody says something to make sure that what they were about to say wasn't defamatory is not constitutional, right?
Yes.
And so the same thing here, if you're being held liable because you wrote some software knowing that someone was going to use that software to violate the law, that has less constitutional issues inherent within it than you were told you're not allowed to publish any software unless we first check that it's not going to be used by bad people to do bad things, which is the fact pattern in the Tornado Cash case, because here they're saying you weren't even allowed to publish these smart contract tools because that's money transmission, which you first had to register for. you had to get a prior license as a prior restraint case. Anyway, so the AI agent complication, I don't even know where to go with that, actually. Like, at that point...
Yeah. I've been struggling with this one, too.
I mean, a lot of it's going to, like... The interesting facts in that hypothetical case would be when they get a hold of how you were prompting this agent, right?
Right.
And did you prompt it at some point to say, hey, AI agent that I've designed, go in and, one behavior you could use to like maximize your trading strategy is put a bunch of orders in and then withdraw them at the last minute. That's now the textbook definition of spoofing. You've shown your intent to spoof, and you're not violating the law because you publish software. You're not, being charged with software publication, which would be against the First Amendment. You're violating the law because you instructed an agency of yours to spoof markets, which is itself a crime.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's more, I mean, we should move on from here, but I think it's more of the edge case if I write an agent and I say, maximize profit within the bounds of what's legal, and it just gets what's legal wrong. Like if I tell my employee, go maximize profits within the bounds of what's legal, and they go do something illegal, it's not like, it's an autonomous agent.
Yeah, and so it would be very hard to charge someone with like actual intent to violate the law if they made a reasonably good faith effort to communicate their interests that this agent not violate the law, right?
Yeah.
Now, the interesting question for the next 10 years is going to be, can you be negligent in instructing agents?
Yes.
Because the easy cases are going to be cases where someone said, go spoof the markets. Okay,
right. That's
intent to commit a crime. If all you said was like, just maximize your trading returns and do it in a morally responsible way.
Yeah.
Knowing that the AI doesn't know what morally responsible was, or that they're not a lawyer, can you be held negligent, which means you didn't exercise due care when you released this agent out into the world? Historically, there's this interesting fact about negligence claims in tort law, which is the area of the common law that deals with negligence, which is you cannot triumph on a cause of action for negligence if your damages as the person who's the victim of someone else's negligence are purely economic losses. So if a badly designed car flies off the road and hits me, I definitely have a products liability or a negligence claim against the manufacturer of the car or the driver of the car. But if they just hit my condo and do damage to my condo and no one was harmed, no human being was harmed in the process, often you are barred from recovering in negligence because your damages are purely economic.
Yes.
So that economic loss rule is this limit to how much you can be responsible for your negligence in the world. You're definitely going to be responsible if you physically harm someone, but you may not be responsible under the traditional common law if all you did was economically harm someone else. I don't think that economic loss rule, which limits that negligence, survives the next 10 years, actually.
Yeah, that seems like a hard one.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that means that, people actually need to worry about their standard of care when doing things online where you don't usually expect someone to get physically harmed, but you definitely could end up harming someone economically, right?
It's interesting. So in our last few minutes here, I do want to talk about what I think is probably the most buzzy thing related to crypto in DC at the moment, which is not the will they, won't they on the Genius Act or market structure, but is the increasing role that one specific meme coin is playing in the American presidency. And this comes at me constantly, right? There will be that, like, I will hear from friends and things like, both in the crypto industry and outside the crypto industry, like, how is this meme coin legal? What is going on here? Isn't this just some sort of, corruption, and foreign actors can buy this Trump token? And, from folks inside the industry, there's a real concern that, like, this is like almost as bad as FTX from an optics perspective. And then from people outside the industry, it's very much of that same view as like, this is this is their exposure to crypto, the same way that the FTX arena and Tom Brady, repping that brand was their exposure back in 22. Yeah. How have you guys, like, I'm sure you have like personal opinions, but like on a Coin Center perspective, like, is this coming up in DC? Is this coming up in international policy? Like, or is this one of those things where it's like Twitter is really focused in on it, but it hasn't really made an impact in DC yet?
So the secondary effects of it are very real. We live in really challenging times politically, right?
Yes.
And that's true. Like, I don't know, listeners at home, I don't know what side of this divide you're on, and I don't judge you for being on either side, but you got to agree that right now it's hard to look across the aisle or look at your friends who you used to be friends with before you realized that they were a Trumper or they were, a lib or whatever, and find some agreement. And I think what the meme coins, the Trump family meme coins have done is supercharge the partisanship with respect to crypto in a way that's not helpful, right? And so we were always sort of tenuous. We were just hoping that we could have a couple of bills in Congress or general propositions that we could get bipartisan agreement on. Yeah. Because there are nonpartisan issues out there. I actually think that the issue of software developer liability is one of the more nonpartisan issues.
There's Dems out there that are very good on crypto too.
Yeah. And they've got Dems out there who are literal heroes of the internet, like Senator Ron Wyden, who stood up for the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, who stood up for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, safe harbor provision, and stopped the Clipper chip from happening. Like, literally, Senator Ron Wyden is like a large percentage responsible for the internet freedom movement actually succeeding to the extent it succeeded back in the 90s. But to take Senator Wyden as an example, like, is he going to be comfortable moving crypto legislation in the Senate when the most visible thing in the news feeds of his constituency, the people who vote for him, the people who fund his campaign, the people who sent him to office to do what he do, is all about like a dinner that's being organized by, President Trump or his family, where if you buy a token, you get a seat at the table, right? Like, that is red meat to Democrats who want to accuse this administration of corruption and graft and things like that. Now, there's a much more nuanced conversation to be had about, corruption is a problem, whether it happens in crypto or not. Yes. It's probably always happened. And if anything, doing corruption on chain is a mistake, but good for everyone because we can see it. It's not happening secretly via, Swiss banks or oligarchs laundering money through the traditional financial system. And so there's a nuanced discussion as to how bad is crypto for things like corruption. And arguably, crypto is actually going to make corruption more difficult because transparent ledgers are transparent ledgers. And then we can get into a discussion about, well, what about privacy tools, et cetera. But like right now, I'm not sure the problem of corruption is made any worse by crypto. If anything, it's made it more visible so we can talk about it, discover it early, and figure out whether it's something that we need to worry about and take action about. But that's all sort of a nuanced discussion of the actual policy equities with respect to conflicts of interest and corruption. The simpler answer to your original question is like, what has this done to the climate in DC? It's now this is all we fight over. We can't have a careful discussion about like whether stablecoin issuers should be regulated without constant interjections about meme coins and corruption, which might even be justified. I'm not saying they're unjustified, but this eats all the oxygen in the room. And it especially eats all the oxygen in the room, I think, for the moderate Democrats who are sort of the deciding votes on a lot of critical things. And my biggest concern, because Coin Center's priorities actually don't revolve around the Genius Act or the market structure bill. Those are important regulatory structures to put guardrails around trusted entities in the space. But our bread and butter is defending the actual developers of these technologies from undue liability, protecting their First Amendment rights to publish code, if you will. And so my concern is where we would previously have had a lot of nonpartisan buy-in on things like, for example, the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which is a fairly simple piece of legislation that just says if you're not a trusted person in this space, you can't be made to first license or register. And it's a bill that's been around for a while from Majority Whip Emmer's office. We're lucky that Richie Torres, smart, powerful new Democrat on the House Financial Services Committee, is now a co-sponsor of that in the House. I'm really, actually, that's the best news I've had in a long time, is that one of these like smart Democrats who wants to be good on crypto has come and joined this incredibly important piece of legislation, even as the partisan climate is ramping up because of things like meme coins, but also just because of like other issues like immigration and things like that. And my concern is, can we move a piece of legislation like that should be nonpartisan, that really is nonpartisan, in this climate where crypto is now in some people's minds synonymous with corruption, or what they see as corrupt activity, right? And that is very challenging and difficult for me, because I just want good policy that protects people's rights. And I hate politics, and I'm frankly quite bad at it. Like, as you're asking me this question on this podcast, I'm like, oh God, I'm going to say something I'm going to regret right now, aren't I? but I don't know. I'm still hopeful because of people like Representative Torres getting on that bill. I'd love to see Senator Wyden, get on a bill like that. I don't know if that's possible. But I hope it is. I hope we can still find issues where we agree, even as the partisanship ramps up.
Yeah, me too. Well, Peter, as we wrap up today, I wanna give you a few minutes to talk about what is Coin Center doing in 2025 and 2026. Where can people learn more? Where can they get involved?
Yeah. So our priorities for the next year, 2 years, are things like the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. I do think there's still this window where we can find a nonpartisan issue like software developers shouldn't be on the hook for prior registration and licensing, like basic American First Amendment principles, where we could get some legislative certainty. If that bill had been passed into law 5 years ago, the Roman Storm case would have been much harder to prosecute. And in general, all the people who want to build these good tools that can both enhance people's privacy but also deter illicit finance would, I think, sleep better at night knowing that they've got this legal safe harbor that says that, you might be charged with money laundering down the road if you knowingly support, criminal activity, but you're not going to be charged with failure to license as a software developer, which is not something you'd expect Americans to need to get a license for. So that's our top legislative priority. Our work with the agencies continues. We take meetings with Treasury, we take meetings with the SEC, we take meetings with the CFTC, the banking regulators, to push for a reasonable approach to this tech. We'll continue being sort of the watchers on the wall there to the extent that policies start to go off the rails. We will hopefully be in those offices arguing for caution or a sensitive approach. One area where I do think we could see conflict in the next few years is on immigration policy, not directly, but in things like, for example, the big, beautiful tax bill that is in Congress right now. There's a 5% remittance tax. And the way it's drafted right now, and I don't think this is intentional, it doesn't cover peer-to-peer transactions using crypto. It only covers transactions that are made through remittance providers, as that had previously been defined in the CFPB's jurisdiction. If there's a move to close that loophole because people start using crypto to avoid the 5% tax when they send money home, that's an area where we could, in a very substantial way, part ways with some of the policy priorities of the Trump administration, for example. So that could be an interesting flashpoint in the next 2 years that we recently wrote a blog post explaining that remittance tax issue, if it's interesting to you. And then our lawsuits continue. We're hoping that the Fifth Circuit will finally give binding, clear remedy in the Tornado Cash sanctions case, at which point our case at the 11th Circuit will be mooted, and I'll be happy to go home after that. Our 6050I lawsuit continues, which is if you receive $10,000 or more in crypto, you have to know the name and physical address and social security number of the person who sent it to you and report that to the IRS. The IRS has said they're just not going to enforce that provision of the Infrastructure Act. until they figure out how to enforce it, but they could turn around and enforce it in any day now. And so our lawsuit is to say that actually that provision is an unreasonable search and seizure and it's unconstitutional. And so hopefully we'll win that one. It's progressing a little bit slowly at the moment because of procedural issues in the Sixth Circuit. And we have another lawsuit, Llewellyn v. Garland, that we're supporting. Michael Llewellyn's a software developer who wanted to publish a non-custodial crowdfunding tool with privacy features, and realized that if he published that, he could be charged with unlicensed money transmission, just like Roman Storm in the Southern District of New York. So he's suing the DOJ for declarative judgment that that's not money transmission. In the wake of some of the charges being dropped against Roman Storm, we'll see if that lawsuit continues to move forward. But it's a good way to apply pressure to ultimately get the right outcome, hopefully, in many of these cases. And we're also supporting Josh Jarrett, who's suing the IRS, arguing that staking rewards are not income when they are received. They should just be taxed when they are sold. Like corn you'd grow in your field. You're not going to get an IRS inspector to say that like 6 new ears have popped up on my corns. You owe taxes.
I don't know. That sounds like a great jobs program.
It is. It would be. So I'm giving you a very long-winded answer of like everything we've got going on: 4 lawsuits, interactions with agencies, 1 bill we'd really like to push through Congress, though it's challenging. Those are our priorities. We publish everything that we write, all our advocacy materials on our website, coincenter.org. If you like the work that we're doing, you want to help us stand up for developer rights and for personal privacy, please donate to our cause. We'll accept your anonymous donations. And now you can use Tornado Cash again to donate to us legally. Although I'm not sure I'd recommend it, because unfortunately a bunch of the front ends that survived the sanctions are actually scams and frauds. So be very careful if you use Tornado Cash to donate to Coin Center. Maybe try Railgun. We
solved one problem and we created 4 others. Yeah. Welcome to crypto.
Exactly.
Awesome. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. I donate to Coin Center. I highly encourage others to do it as well. You guys are a great advocate in the space.
Thanks, Austin. And thank you for your support. You've been very generous over the years.
Thank you.